The town hall smelled faintly of old wood and coffee that had been reheated one too many times. Folding chairs filled the room, lined in uneven rows, and the chatter of people waiting for the local talent night mixed with the squeak of shoes on the floor. It was one of those small-town events where everyone knew everyone else, where laughter came easily, especially when there was someone to laugh at. Near the back of the room, a young woman sat quietly, her hands resting in her lap. She wore a simple dress, nothing fancy, and her hair was tied back in a plain knot. She had signed up last only after a friend convinced her to. Nobody paid much attention when her name was called. Most of the crowd didn't even know who she was, except for a few who recognized her from the bakery across town. The one who boxed pastries smiled politely and never spoke much. When she stood up, a few whispers rose around the room. "She's really going to play?" Someone muttered, half amused. Another voice followed. "Didn't know she could even afford lessons." Quiet laughter rippled across the back rows. She didn't look at them. Her steps were slow, careful as she walked toward the stage. The piano, an old upright one with scratches along the sides, stood under the spotlight like it had seen too many hands and too few tunings. She reached it and sat down, adjusting the bench with both hands. The microphone nearby picked up the faint scrape of wood on wood, and someone coughed to fill the silence. The host gave her a quick nod before stepping off stage, probably expecting her to stumble through a few awkward notes and leave quickly. It wasn't that people were cruel exactly. They just didn't expect much from someone like her. For a moment, she just sat there. Her eyes rested on the keys, pale and chipped at the edges. The hall had gone oddly quiet. Even the laughter seemed to have paused, waiting. Her fingers hovered above the piano, trembling slightly. She could feel her pulse in her throat. The lights above her were hot and her dress felt tighter than before. Every part of her wanted to get up and walk away, but she didn't. She took a slow breath, the kind that steadied her heart, and pressed the first key. The sound was soft, barely more than a whisper. A few people leaned in, confused. Then came another note and another, and slowly a melody began to form. It wasn't loud or flashy, not the kind of music that made people clap right away. But there was something in the way she played, something gentle, honest. Each note seemed to carry a piece of her, fragile yet certain. The crowd didn't realize it at first, but the laughter that had filled the hall only minutes ago was gone. All that remained was the sound of her music filling the air. She played like someone who had spent years hiding behind silence. Her hands moved across the keys, unsure at first, then stronger with every measure. She wasn't reading any sheet, wasn't following anyone's song. This was hers, something she had played in her room late at night when no one was around to listen or judge. A melody she had shaped through heartache, through quiet mornings before work, through lonely evenings when the world outside seemed too heavy to face. People began to notice. The older couple in the front row stopped whispering. The children sitting near the stage leaned forward, their feet still. A man who had been scrolling through his phone looked up and didn't look away again. The sound coming from the old piano didn't belong to an amateur. It was alive, breathing, full of emotion that reached out and held everyone in that room. But she didn't see any of them. In her mind, she was somewhere else. She was back in the tiny room she called home, practicing on an old keyboard that only half worked. She was remembering the nights when her hands hurt from working long hours, and yet she still played until her eyes closed from exhaustion. She was remembering the neighbor who used to play an old piano before he passed away, the man who told her, "Music doesn't care if you're rich or poor. It only listens to your heart." Those words had stayed with her long after the world had forgotten her. Her hands moved faster now, confident, flowing from one key to the next like water over stones. The melody built, gentle at first, then rising in waves of emotion that seemed too big for the small hall to contain. Someone gasped quietly when she hit a high note that trembled in the air, pure and bright. For a moment it felt like time had stopped. The audience wasn't breathing. They were simply listening, caught in the spell of her music. And then, as softly as it began, the song started to fade. The notes grew slower, quieter, like a story nearing its end. She lifted her hands from the keys and silence filled the room once more. No one clapped right away. They didn't know what to do, how to respond. It was as if the air itself needed a second to come back to life. Then slowly one person started to clap. Another followed. And then the entire room was on its feet, applause echoing against the walls like thunder. She sat there, stunned. Her hands rested still on her lap. the warmth of the keys fading from her fingers. She had expected laughter, maybe polite clapping out of pity. She hadn't expected this, people standing, cheering, wiping their eyes. The same faces that once looked at her with doubt now watched her with something different, respect, maybe even awe. She gave a small, uncertain smile and stood up from the bench. For a second, she thought about saying something, but words didn't come. So she just bowed her head slightly, nodded toward the crowd, and began to walk off stage. The applause followed her all the way down the steps and through the side door, where the dim light of the hallway waited. Out there, away from the noise, she leaned against the wall and closed her eyes. Her heart was still racing, her palms still shaking, but there was a new feeling inside her, something light and alive. She didn't think about whether she would win or not. She didn't care about prizes or attention. All she could think about was how, for those few minutes, she had been truly seen. Back in the hall, people were still talking. The host returned to the stage, trying to steady his voice as he introduced the next performer. But even as new acts came up, the audience wasn't quite the same. Their minds lingered on the girl who played like the music was a part of her soul. The bakery girl. The one they had laughed at when she walked up to the piano. Outside, she walked slowly toward home, the cool air brushing against her skin. The night was quiet except for the faint hum of streetlights and the sound of her shoes on the pavement. She smiled to herself, small and private. For the first time in a long while, she felt something close to peace. She didn't know what would come next, but she knew one thing. Tonight she hadn't been invisible. As she reached her street, she could still hear faint echoes of the applause in her mind. It didn't sound like noise anymore. It sounded like a promise. One that told her maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something she had been waiting for all along. She opened her door, stepped inside her quiet little home, and looked at the keyboard sitting by the window. The same broken keys, the same chipped surface. But tonight it looked different. Tonight it looked like hope. She sat down once more and placed her fingers gently on the keys. Her reflection stared back from the darkened glass of the window, tired but smiling, and softly, with no one watching, she began to play again. Not for the crowd, not for applause, but for herself. The next morning, sunlight slipped through the thin curtains of her small room. She woke up slowly, still half dreaming about the night before. For a moment, she couldn't tell if what happened at the talent show had been real or something her tired mind had imagined. The sound of applause still echoed faintly in her ears. She sat up and rubbed her eyes, trying to remember every detail, the crowd, the faces, the way her fingers had stopped trembling halfway through the song. Her old keyboard sat by the window, quiet and a little dusty. She smiled at it. The same keys that once frustrated her now looked like old friends. She reached out and pressed one key. It made a faint clicking sound, the kind that always reminded her that it was never fully tuned. Still, she loved it. That keyboard had been there through everything. Good days, bad days, nights when she felt like giving up. She got dressed and went to work like any other morning. The bakery smelled of fresh bread and warm sugar. Her hands moved automatically, tying boxes, taking orders, smiling politely at customers. It was the same routine she'd followed for years. But today something was different. People were looking at her differently. One of her co-workers leaned over the counter and whispered, "Hey, I saw a video last night. Was that you at the town hall?" She froze for a second, then nodded slowly. The co-worker's eyes widened. "You were amazing. I didn't know you could play like that." She didn't know what to say. Compliments were new to her. Usually, people barely noticed her unless they needed change or directions to the restroom. She just smiled shyly and said, "Thank you." By lunchtime, more people had stopped by the bakery just to see her. Some wanted to talk about the performance, others just wanted to see if the rumors were true. A man with a gray beard came in and told her, "I haven't heard someone play like that in years. You made me feel something I thought I'd forgotten." She thanked him softly, her heart fluttering between disbelief and happiness. That evening, after finishing work, she took the long way home. The air was cool and the sky glowed orange with sunset. She walked past the town hall where the doors were closed and the lights off. She stopped for a moment and stared at the stage through the glass doors. It looked so ordinary now, empty chairs, a quiet piano. But she remembered how it had felt under the lights with everyone watching. For the first time she realized she hadn't been afraid. She had been free. Later that night she sat at her keyboard again. The room was dim, lit only by the streetlight outside her window. She started playing the same song she had performed, letting the music fill her tiny space. It sounded softer here, more personal, but it still carried that same feeling, the one that had silenced a whole room. She didn't know much about music theory, or how professionals described things like tempo or phrasing. She only knew how to play what she felt, and what she felt now was something close to joy. The next day, the video started spreading faster. Someone from the audience had uploaded it online. The title read, "The Bakery Girl Who Stunned Everyone." At first, she didn't even know it existed. She wasn't used to being on the internet or seeing her face on a screen. But by the third day, her coworkers showed her the video on their phones. Thousands of people had already watched it. Comments flooded in, some praising her playing, others saying her music made them cry. She was overwhelmed. The thought that strangers were listening to her, people she would never meet, made her heart race. It was both exciting and terrifying. She didn't think of herself as special. She was just someone who loved music. But now others were calling her gifted, calling her performance unforgettable. Still, not everyone was kind. A few comments joked about her appearance, her plain clothes, the way she sat stiffly at the piano. She read them quietly, then closed the video. She wasn't angry, just reminded of why she had never tried to show herself before. But then she remembered the faces in the crowd that night, the silence before the applause, the tears she saw in someone's eyes. Those were real. Those moments mattered more than anything written on a screen. Over the next few weeks, her life began to change in small but powerful ways. She started receiving messages from local musicians who wanted to collaborate or teach her. A small music cafe downtown invited her to play on weekends. At first, she hesitated. The idea of performing again scared her. What if the first night had been luck? What if she couldn't move people the same way again? But deep down, she knew she had to try. The night of her first cafe performance came faster than she expected. It was a tiny place, warm lights, wooden chairs, the smell of coffee in the air. People talked softly, waiting. When she walked in, carrying nothing but a small bag and her nervous heart, the owner greeted her with a friendly smile. "Take your time," he said. "No pressure here. Just play what you love." She sat down at the piano, took a deep breath, and let her fingers fall on the keys. The sound filled the cafe, smooth and tender. She didn't look at the crowd. She just played. The melody she chose was new, something she'd written in her head while walking home from work one night. It was about quiet dreams, about not giving up even when no one believes in you. People stopped talking. Cups were left half-raised, conversations paused mid-sentence. The same stillness from the town hall settled over the room again. The music carried something invisible, something that touched hearts without words. When the song ended, the silence broke into gentle applause. A few people even stood. She smiled shyly as always and nodded in thanks. This time, though, she didn't walk off right away. She played again, and again. Each song seemed to unlock another piece of her story. After the show, people came to talk to her. Some said her music reminded them of someone they loved. Others said it gave them peace. One woman held her hand and said, "Whatever pain you've been through, I can hear it, and it's beautiful." Those words stayed with her, because that was exactly what she had hoped for. Not fame, not praise, just connection. That night, walking home under the streetlights, she thought about how strange life could be. For years, she'd been invisible, moving quietly through her days. Now people were hearing her voice, not through words, but through the piano. She realized something important. She didn't need to prove herself to anyone. The laughter from the first night no longer mattered. What mattered was that she had dared to sit down and play. In the following weeks, her story spread further. A local newspaper wrote an article about her rise from the bakery counter to the stage. They called her the silent pianist. Musicians from other towns reached out. She was invited to perform at a charity event, then another. Each time she felt nervous, but she learned that fear was just part of the journey. Every performance wasn't perfect, but it was honest. One evening, after finishing another performance, she sat alone backstage with a cup of tea. The lights outside were fading, and the muffled sound of people leaving drifted in. She smiled to herself, thinking how strange it felt to be here. Months ago, no one would have believed this could happen. But she hadn't changed that much. She was still the same person, still humble, still unsure of what tomorrow would bring. The only difference was that now people were finally listening. Before heading home, she went to the piano one last time. She touched the keys softly like greeting an old friend. She thought about the first night again, the laughter, the whispers, the weight of doubt on her shoulders. And then she thought about how the music had lifted that weight away. She realized something that night. People can doubt you, mock you, ignore you, but if you stay true to what you love, the truth will find its way out. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but someday. As she left the empty hall, she whispered quietly, "Thank you." Not to anyone in particular, but to the piano, to music itself. To the part of her that never stopped believing. The air outside was cool, the stars faint above her. She looked up and smiled. It didn't matter how far she went or who watched her play next. What mattered was that she had found her voice, and once it's found, it can never truly be silenced. After a few months, her face had become familiar in places she never expected. People recognized her at the grocery store, at the bus stop, even at the bakery where she still worked part-time. Some smiled shyly, others stopped to thank her for her music. A few even asked for photos, which always made her blush. She was still getting used to the idea that people cared. For so long, she had been invisible, just another face passing through life quietly. But behind the small fame and attention, there was a story nobody really knew. The calmness they saw in her now had been built through years of storms. She had learned to smile even when life felt too heavy. Music hadn't been a hobby for her. It had been her only way to survive. When she was a child, the world had already felt unfair. Her parents had both worked hard, but had little to show for it. There were days when bills piled up on the kitchen table, and nights when dinner was just bread and tea. But there was one thing that always made those days easier. A neighbor who lived down the street, an old man who played piano in the evenings. His small house always had the window open, and through it came gentle music that drifted into the night air. She used to sit by her window just to listen. Sometimes she'd close her eyes and imagine she was the one playing. One day, the old man noticed her standing outside and invited her in. She remembered how shy she felt walking into his home. The piano looked enormous to her, its black and white keys glowing under the warm light. When she touched them for the first time, she felt something she had never felt before, a strange kind of peace. The old man smiled and said, "Music doesn't ask who you are. It only listens." Those words stayed with her forever. He started teaching her a few simple notes, showing her how each sound could tell a story. She learned quickly, not because she wanted to be great, but because she needed the comfort it gave her. Every evening after school, she would visit him, listening carefully to every lesson, even when her hands stumbled. He never scolded her for mistakes. He would just laugh softly and say, "That's music too, it's just finding its way." Years passed and her love for music grew. But life had its own plans. When she turned 16, the old man passed away. She remembered standing outside his small home, hearing the silence where music used to be. It broke something inside her. There was no piano in her house, no one else who cared about notes or rhythm. Her parents couldn't afford lessons, and even if they could, there was no one left to teach her. Still, she refused to let go. One afternoon, she found an old keyboard at a thrift shop. It was missing keys and barely worked, but she bought it anyway with what little she had saved. From then on, that keyboard became her best friend. She would come home from school, finish her chores, and sit by the window, playing quietly until night fell. Sometimes the neighbors would hear faint tunes coming from her window. They didn't know that behind those soft notes was a girl teaching herself everything she could remember, the lessons, the songs, the emotions. Then came harder times. Her father got sick and her mother had to take on extra work. The little house that once felt full began to feel empty. She learned to be strong because there was no other choice. After her father passed away, she dropped out of school for a while to help her mother make ends meet. Life turned into a cycle of work, worry, and exhaustion. But every night, no matter how tired she was, she still played. The piano became her way of talking to someone who was no longer there. Years went by, and music remained the only constant in her life. When her mother eventually passed too, she found herself completely alone. The silence in the house was unbearable. But when she played, it felt like they were still with her somehow. It was the only thing that kept her heart from breaking completely. So when she walked onto that stage months ago, it wasn't just a performance. It was a lifetime of emotion finding its voice. Every note had carried memories of loss, of love, of survival. And that's why people had felt something that night. They didn't know her story, but they felt it through her music. One day, after another cafe performance, a journalist approached her. He wanted to write about her life, to share her journey with a wider audience. She hesitated. Talking about her past wasn't easy. It wasn't filled with glamour or success, just years of struggle and quiet strength. But eventually she agreed. She wanted people to know that dreams could grow even in the darkest places. When the article was published, it spread quickly. The headline read, "From Broken Keys to Beautiful Music, the story of the girl who played her pain away." The story touched many. People from across the country sent her letters, some sharing their own struggles, others thanking her for giving them hope. She read every single one, sometimes with tears in her eyes. What touched her most was a message from a young boy who said, "I wanted to quit learning piano because I thought I wasn't good enough. Then I saw your story. Now I practice every day." She smiled for a long time after reading that. It reminded her of herself, how close she had come to giving up and how music had saved her every time. A few months later, she received an invitation to visit a nearby music school. The director had read about her and wanted to meet her. When she arrived, she was nervous. The students there came from wealthy families with shiny instruments and expensive lessons. She felt out of place. But when she sat at their grand piano and began to play, the room fell silent, just like it had at the town hall. When she finished, the director simply said, "You play with heart." That's something no money can buy. From that day forward, she started teaching small workshops at the school. Not formal lessons, just talks about feeling the music, not fearing mistakes, and finding yourself in every song. The students loved her honesty. Some called her the teacher who doesn't teach notes but teaches heart. Her life still wasn't perfect. She still lived simply, still worked part-time, still carried her past quietly inside her. But she had found purpose. She was helping others discover what she had found years ago, that music isn't about showing off. It's about healing, expressing, and sharing. Sometimes late at night, she would visit the old neighborhood. The street where the old man used to live was quieter now. His house was gone, replaced by something new. But she could still hear his words in her mind. Music doesn't ask who you are, it only listens. She would whisper them softly and smile, feeling grateful for how far she had come. It amazed her how one small act, sitting at a piano that night, had changed her entire life. What had started as a moment of courage had turned into a path of meaning. The girl who once practiced on broken keys now inspired others to keep going. Sometimes she would still think about that first crowd, the ones who had laughed before she played. Not with bitterness, but with understanding. They didn't know her story back then. They couldn't have known what those notes meant to her. And maybe that's what made her performance so powerful. Because the music carried everything she never said aloud. Now, when she plays, it's not just for herself anymore. It's for the old man who believed in her, for her parents who never heard her perform, for the lonely kid she used to be, and for every person out there who feels unseen. And every time she finishes a song, she still does the same thing she did that first night. She closes her eyes, takes a deep breath, and whispers a quiet thank you. To life, to music, and to the silence that once made her stronger. Time moved forward quietly, but her story only grew louder. What started as a single performance in a small town had turned into something much bigger than she could ever have dreamed. Her music, once hidden behind closed windows and tired nights, had reached people across cities, across countries even. It didn't matter that she wasn't famous in the glamorous sense. What mattered was that her sound had found a home in the hearts of strangers. Still, she tried to keep her life as normal as she could. She continued her simple routines. Early mornings, long walks, quiet evenings by her old keyboard. But now she was often interrupted by new messages, invitations, and letters. Some came from musicians who wanted to meet her. Others were from schools asking her to speak to their students. A few even came from concert organizers who wanted her to perform in bigger halls. At first, she hesitated. The idea of stepping onto a grand stage under bright lights in front of hundreds of people, it frightened her. She wasn't trained, not like others. She didn't know how to move or smile for cameras. She only knew how to sit and play. But deep inside, she also knew she couldn't run away from what music had given her. It had lifted her from the shadows. Now she had to share it. The first big concert came 6 months later. It was held in the city's cultural center, a place she had only seen in pictures. When she arrived, her heart raced at the sight of the tall building and the crowd waiting outside. Her name was printed on the poster by the door. It felt strange seeing it there, real and bold, as if she finally belonged somewhere she never thought she could. Backstage, her hands trembled slightly. She looked at the piano sitting under the lights and whispered to herself, "It's still the same instrument, just keys and sound." She took a slow breath and walked toward it. When she began to play, the hall fell silent. The sound was clearer here, more powerful. Every note seemed to stretch into the distance, touching corners she couldn't even see. She played the same song from that first night, the one that changed everything. But this time she wasn't scared. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She was simply sharing what had always lived inside her. When the song ended, the applause was deafening. People stood clapping, cheering, calling her name. She bowed slightly, smiling with tears in her eyes. For a brief moment, she thought about all the nights she had spent practicing alone, wondering if anyone would ever listen. Now they were listening, really listening. After the concert, journalists came forward asking questions about her past, her music, her future plans. She answered softly, careful with her words. She didn't like talking about fame. To her, music wasn't about success, it was about feeling alive. One interviewer asked her, "What do you think when you play?" She paused for a moment before answering. "I think about everything I've lost," she said quietly, "and everything I've found because of that loss." The room went silent, and for a second everyone seemed to understand. That interview spread online like wildfire. People called her humble, authentic, inspiring. They said her words carried the same power as her music. But she didn't see herself as an inspiration. She still lived in her small home, still walked the same streets, still made her own tea before sitting by her keyboard each night. She was just grateful, to the piano, to the people, to life itself for giving her a second chance. Months passed, and more invitations followed. She performed at charity events, community festivals, and small theaters. Each place had its own kind of warmth. Sometimes the crowd was huge. Sometimes it was only a few dozen people, but she played with the same heart every time. What amazed her most wasn't the attention she received, but the stories people told her afterward. A mother once came to her with tears in her eyes, saying her son had started learning piano after watching her videos. A young man said her music helped him through a dark time. A teacher said she played one of her songs in class to remind students that dreams can come from anywhere. Those words mattered to her more than anything. She had once believed she had no voice. Now she realized her music spoke louder than words ever could. Still, not everything was easy. The sudden attention brought pressure too. There were expectations, opinions, even criticism. Some said her technique wasn't professional. Others said she didn't belong among trained musicians. At first those words hurt, but she remembered what the old man once told her. Music doesn't ask who you are. And with that, she learned to let go of people's opinions. She knew she wasn't perfect. Her notes sometimes slipped, her rhythm wasn't flawless, but her emotions were real. And that was what people truly connected to. One evening, she returned to her hometown for a special performance. It was to be held at the same community center where it all began. When she walked inside, everything felt both familiar and new. The chairs were neatly lined, the lights brighter than before, and the old piano had been replaced with a polished one. Still, she could almost hear the echoes of that first night. The laughter, the whispers, the moment when everything changed. As she stood on stage again, memories filled her chest. She could almost see her younger self, nervous and trembling, afraid of failing. She smiled softly at the thought. Then she sat down and began to play. The melody started quietly, almost like a whisper. Then it grew, rising with emotion and strength. People in the audience leaned forward, some closing their eyes. The same piano that once carried her doubts now carried her triumph. When she finished, the silence broke into applause that felt endless. Afterward, the host asked her to say a few words. She stepped up to the microphone and looked out at the crowd. "The last time I played here," she said, "I thought people were laughing at me. But that night changed my life. It taught me that we never know how far one small act of courage can take us." Her voice wavered slightly as she added, "If there's anyone here who's ever been afraid to try, I hope you remember, you only have to start once. The rest will follow." The crowd stood and clapped. Many had tears in their eyes. It wasn't just a performance, it was a homecoming. That night when she returned home, she felt lighter than she had in years. She placed her old keyboard on the table, gently running her fingers across its broken keys. "We made it," she whispered. Her story reached television screens soon after. A documentary team followed her journey, from the bakery to the big stage. They filmed her teaching children, performing for charities, and walking through her old neighborhood. When the documentary aired, people from all over sent messages of love and support. Some called her a legend. Others simply called her Hope. But even with all the praise, she never forgot where she came from. She still practiced every night, still played for herself before anyone else. Music to her was not about being better. It was about being honest. Sometimes she would visit small schools and community halls, playing for children who reminded her of herself, quiet, shy, uncertain. She would tell them, "Don't wait for people to believe in you. Believe in yourself first." Those words always seemed to light something in their eyes. Her journey became less about her and more about others. She had found peace in knowing that her music could make someone feel less alone, and that, to her, was the real reward. One day, as she watched the sunset from her window, she thought about the laughter from that first night. It used to haunt her, but now it made her smile, because she realized that sometimes what begins as laughter ends in applause. Sometimes the ones who doubt you the most end up standing for you in the end. The world had changed around her, but inside she remained the same, a girl who found her voice through broken keys, who played her pain into something beautiful, who proved that music isn't about where you come from, but what you carry inside. That night, before going to bed, she sat at her keyboard once more. The keys were still chipped, still imperfect, but when she began to play, the room filled with warmth the same way it always did. Her fingers moved softly, her eyes closed, and a peaceful smile appeared on her face because deep down, she knew the truth. Recognition might fade, applause might stop, but the music she created would live on, echoing quietly in the hearts of everyone it had touched. Time had a quiet way of moving forward, and she had changed along with it. The shy girl who once sat at a small-town piano trembling under the weight of judgment had grown into a woman who carried confidence in the way she touched the keys, the way she moved through life, and the way she looked at the people who listened to her music. She was still humble, still kind, and still carried the same quiet heart that had first found its voice in the shadows. That evening, she returned to the town where it all began. The streets were familiar. The bakery still stood at the corner. The little park where she had walked as a child looked the same, and the old community center had been renovated, its windows shining under the evening lights. She felt a strange mix of nerves and warmth. So much had happened since the first night she had dared to play. She thought about the laughter, the whispers, the doubt that had once surrounded her. And she thought about the applause, the standing ovations, and the people who had cheered her name. She walked toward the community center, carrying nothing but herself and a small bag. Inside, the hall was filled with people of all ages, many of whom had come specifically to see her perform. There were familiar faces from the town, and some she recognized from her travels, musicians, students, and even strangers who had been touched by her music online. The room was filled with expectation, but there was no judgment now, only anticipation. She approached the piano and ran her fingers lightly across the keys. It was an old upright, polished and sturdy, waiting patiently to tell the story again. She paused for a moment and closed her eyes, feeling the weight of everything she had been through. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from the excitement of being alive in that moment. She took a slow, deep breath and began to play. The first note filled the room softly like a whisper. Then another, and another, until a melody rose from the piano that was familiar yet new. She played not just with her fingers but with her heart, letting every emotion, every loss, every victory, every quiet moment of hope flow through the music. The audience listened in silence. There were no distractions, no whispers, just the sound of her music and the way it wrapped itself around every person in the room. As she continued, she remembered the nights she had practiced alone, the broken keyboard by the window, the neighbor who had believed in her, and the parents who had never been able to hear her play. All those memories mingled in the music, giving it weight and meaning. Each note told a story. Each pause spoke louder than words ever could. By the middle of the performance, she could feel the energy of the audience. Some had tears in their eyes. Others were smiling, moved by the honesty in her music. She didn't play for them. She played with them, letting the sound connect hearts without saying a single word. It was a conversation that only music could have. When the final note faded, there was a moment of silence. The kind that follows something extraordinary, when everyone in the room realizes they have just witnessed something rare. And then the applause began, soft at first, then building into a roar that filled every corner of the hall. People were on their feet, cheering, clapping, some even crying. She sat back, letting the sound wash over her, a mixture of disbelief and joy filling her chest. She stood and bowed slightly, smiling with tears in her eyes. It was not pride she felt, but gratitude. Gratitude for the music that had always been there, for the people who had believed in her, for the journey that had brought her to this very moment. She realized that the shy girl who had once been laughed at was no longer invisible. She was seen, truly seen, not just for her talent but for the courage to share it. After the performance, she spent time speaking with people in the audience. Many told her how her music had touched them, how it had inspired them to keep going, to pursue their own dreams despite doubt or fear. One woman said, "You've given me hope when I thought it was gone." A young man whispered, "I've been afraid to follow my passion. You showed me that it's never too late to start." She listened quietly, her heart swelling with a mix of humility and joy. That night, walking home under the streetlights, she reflected on the journey. She thought about the first night, the audience that had laughed, and the tiny community center where it all began. The memory no longer brought shame, only a reminder of how far she had come. It was proof that courage, even in small doses, could create change that reaches far beyond oneself. Over the next months, her life continued to evolve. She traveled to new cities, performing in halls of varying sizes. Some were intimate, just a few dozen people, while others were grand stages with hundreds in the audience. Each time she played with the same honesty, the same devotion to music. Fame had not changed her, nor had recognition. She continued to live simply, teach where she could, and return home to her small apartment each night, where the old keyboard still waited, a reminder of where it all began. Her story spread further. Online videos of her performances reached thousands more. People wrote letters, emails, and messages, sharing their own stories of struggle, hope, and perseverance. She responded to many of them, offering encouragement, a listening ear, and sometimes just a quiet acknowledgement that she had heard their words. It became clear that her music was more than notes. It was a lifeline for those who felt lost, unheard, or unseen. Despite all the attention, she remained grounded. She still cooked her own meals, walked the same streets, and practiced quietly at night. She didn't seek glory or accolades. She sought connection. She played for those who couldn't play for themselves, for those who had never been seen, for anyone who needed a gentle reminder that beauty could grow even in unexpected places. One evening, after a long performance in a city far from home, she sat backstage with her tea, thinking about her journey. She remembered the laughter, the doubt, the nights of silent practice, and the people who had shaped her life in ways both small and large. She realized that the legend she had become was not because of fame, but because of persistence, authenticity, and the courage to share what was inside her heart. She often visited schools, community centers, and small towns, sharing music with children who reminded her of herself. She encouraged them to play not for approval but for joy, for expression, for the simple love of creating sound. Watching their eyes light up as they discovered their own voices reminded her of the first night she had dared to sit at the piano. Each child who discovered their courage through music became a part of her story, a continuation of the legacy she had never planned to create. Sometimes she would return to the town hall where it all began. The building had been renovated, the chairs polished, and the piano replaced, but the memory remained alive. She would sit at the new piano and play, letting the audience experience the same music that had once transformed her own life. Each time she was reminded of the truth that had guided her from the beginning. Talent is nothing without courage, and courage is nothing without heart. One quiet evening, after playing for a small crowd, she walked home alone. The streets were empty, the stars above faintly glowing. She paused to look up and whispered a quiet thank you, to life, to music, to every moment that had led her here. She knew the journey was ongoing. She knew there would still be challenges, fears, and doubts. But she also knew that nothing could silence her now. She had become the voice she once longed to hear, the music she once dreamed of playing, and the hope for everyone who needed to believe in themselves. In her apartment, She sat at her old keyboard one last time before bed. The chipped keys, the worn surface, the familiar sound, it all felt like home. She played softly, letting the music drift through the room, through the night, and into the quiet streets beyond. Each note carried her story, her struggles, her triumphs, and her love for what she did. It wasn't just a song, it was her life. And in that music, she found peace. Not peace of fame or applause, but peace of knowing that she had lived fully, loved deeply, and shared herself bravely. The shy girl who had once been laughed at had left her mark on the world, not through perfection, but through courage, honesty, and a heart willing to play. She closed her eyes, let her fingers rest, and whispered softly, "We made it." And with that, she turned off the light, knowing that tomorrow, the music would continue and her story would live on, not just in her hands, but in the hearts of everyone who had heard her play.